Before we get started in today's episode, I would like to thank all of the supporters who have funded Queer AuDHD BIPOC so far, and they are Ima, Brian, Rach, Bobby, Kate V, Tori Lopez, Mattia M, Jason Sperber, Nicole, Mira, Rachel from Autistic as Fuck, and an anonymous supporter. We are 82% funded. Help us hit our first goal and pay all of our interviewees at rewilding.cc/book. Hey everyone, welcome to this limited series podcast called Queer AuDHD BIPOC. I'm TQ. We're back again today with a wonderful new guest. And if you're new here, this podcast and our upcoming book is to help other queer, Black, Brown, Indigenous, Asian, South Asian, Middle Eastern, and people of color who are both autistic and ADHD because we exist. And it's to help us feel seen and less alone and supported while living in multiple margins. So today I'm joined by an acquaintance. This is our first time like talking to each other face to face, but we have chatted and we fundraised for our disabled friend Nara in Palestine. Riz also, their handle on Instagram is yarn underscore against underscore the underscore machine. So, Riz, would you like to say hi and introduce yourself and how you identify to the audience?
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm so honored. My name is Riz. My pronouns are they, them, baby girl. I am a Afro-Indigenous, trans and two-spirit radical yarn artist, wheelchair user, grad student. Yeah, I'm trying to think of how else I would identify. My project, Yarn Against the Machine, it is an art-based disability justice project where I'm a crocheter and tufter, and I create yarn-based projects to raffle off for community members, specifically disabled community members in need of funds, whether that's for medication, assistive devices to stabilize their housing, for relocation. Currently, I'm collaborating with a local anarchist bookstore to sell a Fuck Ice hoodie to raffle off for a community member that is self-deporting. So yeah, love a good collaboration. Please hit me up for collaborations.
Yeah, I saw that post that hoodie is so cool. And I also noticed that Zoom glitched when you said fuck ice. And I'm like,
No.
who's listening? Yeah, everyone, please go follow Riz because they make the most incredible fiber art. As a very like beginner crocheter, I'm always in awe. Like the wheelchair wheel covers that you've made, just amazing. Yeah, and how did you discover that you're ADHD? What was that journey like?
Yeah, so some Riz lore. I actually went to a K through 12 private residential boarding school from the time that I was 9 till the time that I was 18. I would very much liken it to a re-education center. I feel like Zoom is going to start glitching again. It's a private school in Hershey, PA for low-income families. However, I've written papers about this in grad school, and I do not think it is coincidental that once the local re-education center known as the Carlisle Indian School closed down, they started finally accepting students of color and negatively racialized folks. So it felt like, at first it was an orphanage for young white boys, and then they eventually started accepting white women, and then they started accepting people of color. Yeah, right around the time that re-education center closed. So I would say my experience was dramatically and drastically different from the experiences of low-income white students. When I got there, at 9 years old, I was still struggling to learn how to do my own hair. And so they were just like, well, it would be really convenient for us all if we just cut it all off. So like very re-education center-esque of like, when I got there, they just cut all my hair off because it was easier. When I had like social skill handbooks that I felt like were an attempt to sort of civically assimilate me into whiteness. So it was like, this is how you set a table, and this is how you properly introduce yourself. I had to learn other skills like horseback riding and, things like, to a poor Black kid coming from the Bronx, didn't make any sense. I'm like, how are these life skills? How are these going to help me succeed in life? And by the time that I graduated, they had created these sort of alliance partnerships with some of the local colleges. So I ended up going to Dickinson College for undergrad, and it was sort of like Dickinson was struggling with diversity and they needed to get these low income students into college. And so they created this sort of alliance of like, hey, if you scoop up some of the top 10% of our graduating class, a lot of whom are Black, we can help you with your diversity numbers. You can help us with reduced tuition. And then it started making sense. I'm like, oh, it's because these rich white kids horseback ride, or I need to know how to ski because because they have a ski club. But yeah, that's when I feel like my ADHD symptoms really started manifesting. I felt like before at boarding school, I lived with 12 other kids to a house. If a young kid is struggling with a problem, you're not getting the attention you need. We lived with a very conservative Christian white married couple. I would describe all of my house parents that way. They have their own little apartment attached to the house, and then the 12 of us, mind you, we're like 9, 10, 11. We were like running the rest of the house by ourselves. So we were doing all the chores, the laundry. They helped out with food and groceries, but other than that. So at first, when I was younger, it just really manifested as what I would describe, quote unquote, as perfectionism, of me just taking a really long time on all of my homework assignments. And because I performed very well in school, no one thought anything of it. But I think by the time I got to high school, I was like, I really struggle with time management now that I'm being expected to manage some of these responsibilities on my own. I don't have a structured life where they're telling me at 12 p.m. I have to be here and at 1 p.m. I have to be here. Like when I am in charge of managing my own time and left to my own devices, I am doing my homework in the bathroom stall the class before. So I really struggled with that in high school. And when you get to high school, you sort of live in what's called transitional living to prepare you for college. So it's more independent. You have an apartment, you're doing your own grocery shopping. Mind you, I'm like 17, 18. Like I had no business doing this. So there was really no one checking in on me. And by the time I got to college, it was just, I was struggling so much. I like almost completely failed out of my first year of college. I was on academic probation and my professors were just really confused because they're like, well, you're a really bright student. You participate in class. You very obviously know all of the information. You always turn your assignments in late. You're late to class or you're sleeping in class. I was working overnight to make ends meet and most students didn't have jobs at my college. And then when it came to the timed exams, I remember one time from one of my sociology classes, I just had so much anxiety and was just struggling with the concept of a timed test that I didn't even write my name on my paper. I filled out no questions. I sat there for the entire time. I was like, I just physically cannot do this. It was really interesting because I noticed a little scheme of some of the, Dickinson, for context, is a very rich white liberal arts college, the private liberal arts. I ended up doing my senior dissertation on elite reproduction via education, very unironically. And at the time, there was this subcategory of the New York Times that published socio-political data that talked about some of the wealth of US colleges. And it was like, how many of the students are considered rich? Like, what is the average familial income of their families? How many of their low income students, if they have any, go on to be rich adults? And it was like half a student is considered poor in my college. So I had no friends. Yeah, it was like half of a student statistically. It wasn't even a whole student. So I was like one of the only poor kids, like some of
Oh
the
my
people
gosh.
were like, oh, do you want to come to our yacht in Turks and Caicos for spring break? And I was like, I don't even have a passport. So I was really struggling with that. And I noticed the scheme of when some of the students weren't performing as well as they wanted to, their parents would sort of pay doctors to finesse the ADHD diagnosis so that they could get disability accommodations and perform better. But meanwhile, I was sort of like struggling with even affording the ADHD panel. So it sort of escalated to the point where I was like, look, I'm on academic probation. It's not because I don't understand the material. I need accommodations. You're telling me I need to pay for a $2,000 ADHD panel to even access the accommodations. And I'm one of the only poor students at this college. So essentially, I just bullied the college into paying for it by telling them that they were classist. And then my life started making sense because I actually did have ADHD and and not that the diagnosis validated it, but it was more so I was able to then access institutional support and my GPA went up and now I'm in graduate school. So yeah, that's how I really struggled. For me, it manifested academically. And then, when I went on to be an adult, of course, there were things at work that I struggled with, but I think the last thing I'll say is I think it's really interesting as someone who is on ADHD medication. I was struggling to have my insurance cover my medication this year when we went to go file the new prior authorization. And it's because they were saying I was no longer school aged, as if you only struggle with ADHD in school. And the irony of it is, what is school aged when I'm in grad school? I'm still a student, but it was saying because I was over 18, I guess there's this new policy that ADHD meds are only covered for 3 to 18. And the reason for the denial was you're not school aged and therefore you should not be struggling with ADHD related symptoms.
I'm really sorry to hear about your insurance, and that's complete bullshit. Did you have ADHD diagnosed first and then like you realized you were autistic later on? Like what was that journey like for you?
I think the formal diagnosis of ADHD led me to start to conceptualize autism because it's like it's a really high crossover between folks that have ADHD and folks that have autism. And I really struggled with bullying in high school and I never really understood sometimes that I was being bullied. Yeah, and I think that's where it really started coming from, was just me recognizing due to my emergence, I just didn't experience the world or even social interactions in the way that other people did. And then it's also, I have three siblings. So looking across the three of us, I'm like, yeah, we're definitely all autistic. Our autism symptoms just manifest in very different ways. And I think the catalyst for me understanding my autism more deeply was my youngest brother being born. So I have one older brother and two younger brothers. However, my youngest brother was not born until I was almost in high school. So there's a huge age gap there. And I just remember my mom really struggling with the level of support needs he had, constantly asserting, like, none of my other kids were a problem. Like, I didn't struggle with any of these things with any of you. And I just had a moment where I was like, no, I think the ways in which we struggled navigating the world didn't inconvenience you in the way that it does my youngest brother. And that's what you're naming, right? Like, I think of the older of my younger brothers had selective mutism all throughout the entire time we were at boarding school. So my oldest brother and my younger, or the oldest of the younger brothers, we all went to boarding school together. We enrolled together. My older brother eventually got kicked out for behavioral reasons. And then my younger brother that was at the school with me, his house parents and caretakers just didn't know what to do with him. And it would be fall on me of like, oh, you're his sibling, come talk to him. And I would say, oh, like, I'm also a kid, but it was sort of like he just didn't speak for years. But of course, a quote unquote quiet child is not an inconvenience to a caregiver. So my mom just never thought anything of it. It was like, oh yeah, he's just quiet. And I'm like, when's the last time you've heard him speak? So yeah, it was really interesting seeing that from the eyes of my parent, and I think that's when it really started clicking. And for me, like, understanding that it really is a spectrum with people experiencing different symptoms and how those symptoms manifest and to like which level we experience those symptoms. I think, we're talking about intersections of like different marginalized identities. And I think that thread of me stating a lot of people removing disability from what the disabled person's own internal experiences with it to like the level of which you're inconveniencing other people. I would say that's true for both my more physical disability symptoms with hEDS and also like neurodivergence and disability and autism, especially now. I don't know if I shared with you, but now I'm a clinical social work intern and developmental and behavioral pediatrics research fellow at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia now, specialized neurodevelopmental disabilities. So yeah, I think just even seeing the way that people are like have careers dedicated to supporting neurodiverse populations still struggle with conceptualizing what disability is and how to name it and how they describe it. And it's often, yeah, how much of a burden are you to your caregivers and not necessarily like what is your own internal experience with your disability.
How else would you talk about all your different experiences, living in multiple margins at the same time?
I think I will recall a story that I have a friend who's, also negatively racialized and has autism and ADHD. They were interviewing me for a residency about mobility devices that they were doing. And I shared this experience of, I feel like the first very tangible intersection for me was, now I'm a wheelchair user, but when I was at my boarding school that I was talking about, and I was talking about some of the dichotomies or divergent experiences of negatively racialized folks at the school and white folks at the school, I think one of the most prevalent ones for me growing up was, I want to tie this back to ableism, and it was that the Black students would never be academically successful. It was drilled into me that we would never be academically successful. We were not quote unquote intelligent enough. We would never have those skills. It didn't matter if I was in the top 10% of my graduating class. It didn't matter if I had a 4.0. I remember my career counselor coming to me and just like looking over my transcript and just genuinely being in shock. And I was like, oh, like what's surprising to you? And she's like, well, you have an A in physics and an A in biology. And I was like, yes, those are my grades. That's correct. And she's like, and like kind of whispers like, oh, well, you're Black. Like, how do those things happen? Like, how do those things make sense? And I remember trying to report her to one of my other teachers, and they're like, oh, she would never say that. And I was like, that's so interesting because she said that. We were really pushed into sports, and it was sort of this like narrative from our white caregivers, like, oh, if you wanted to make it out of the hood, if you wanted to be successful, you have to be an athlete. And so a lot of us were forced into prioritizing sports over academic. athletics. And so I was a year-round athlete. Mind you, I started experiencing disability symptoms between like 14 and 16. So I'm a year-round athlete. I'm doing softball, varsity basketball, long distance running for track, indoor and outdoor. And I'm also doing marching percussion because I don't know if I've shared, but I'm a musician, I'm a drummer. So I'm also carrying drums twice my weight for
Oh
marching.
my gosh.
And there would just be mornings where I physically could not like get up and walk. Like I would just be laying on the floor in agony. Or even after my track meets, they would just say like, "Oh, you just have to push, you have to get through it." But I had started experiencing, so at first I was misdiagnosed with fibromyalgia, and part of it was like I was experiencing these like nerve-related issues where I would run my track meets, I would come in first, it would be fine, I'd go to like state championships. But for the next 72 hours, I couldn't feel my legs and I couldn't walk. And they would just act like it was so normal. And they'd be like, "Oh, no, it's cool. We have your wheelchair waiting for you. We'll have someone push you around for like the next couple of hours. And, as long as you're ready before the next meet, as long as you're healed and rested." And I just really started thinking about the ways in which, like racism and ableism and classism, just we're all, because they were coming from white caregivers towards like low income black students at this boarding school. And yeah, it was just really interesting in the ways in which my disability symptoms were negated. And it wasn't that they were completely ignored. They were putting me in physical therapy, and I was going to like Hershey Med for testing, and but it was like a means to an end. It was just like, oh, just to figure out how to further push you through these track meets, not to recognize disability. And I do think a large part of that is that ableism was just very much embedded into the fabric of the school and that institution, the boarding school, and you weren't allowed to be disabled and enrolled in that school. So even before I was a student, part of my admissions process was an IQ test, like an in-person IQ test. Like I had to pass the IQ test. And that's why my youngest brother was not able to be enrolled. And even when it came to, mental health related disabilities, there was like a very public documentary and lawsuit in which they would provide us with psychiatric care and counselors, but it was more so to monitor who was a liability towards the PR of the school. So if you started actually experiencing mental health symptoms, they would expel you, not treat you. And so there was a student that, content warning, suicidality and suicidal ideation. There was a student who did start struggling with her mental health. The school decided it seems like this person might follow through with this. We should expel her so she does this at home and the school's not tied to this case. And that's exactly what happened. And the school then took this person's body and buried them on the on-campus graveyard once they passed at home. And the parents tried to sue the school because, when you sign over your care of your child to the school, they say that they are responsible for all of your medical costs. And that includes behavioral health, right? And then I believe the school countersued and was just sort of like, well, if you were never poor in the first place, you would have never had to send your kid here. I think a lot of my early childhood experiences were my caregivers trying to erase the fact that I had disability or only treat it as a means to an end to keep me functioning as an athlete as if that was the only track. No pun intended. The only path that I had in life.
When you had like the numbness and all that, did that turn out to be hEDS?
Yeah. So that's how I discovered I had EDS long term. I think what I was experiencing at the time was like hypermobility to quite frankly, I was over exercising for like what my disability needs were. Yeah. And so at first I was misdiagnosed with fibromyalgia. And of course, I don't know if you remember all those years ago, like fibromyalgia was seen as like a not real disability
Yeah.
diagnosis for like, we don't really know what's happening with you, but we want you to like leave us alone because you keep asking for answers. So we're going to give you this diagnosis. But then when you go to treatment, half of the doctors are going to look at you sideways because they're thinking this isn't even a real condition. But yes, I was later on diagnosed with hEDS. And part of that was through going to a service dog program and college with someone who was a twin that had EDS, and them and their sibling had EDS. And I was sort of like, we have a lot of the same symptoms. And they're like, yeah, I wasn't trying to like call you out, but you definitely have EDS. And then when I went to go get testing, my doctor was like, yeah, you have EDS. So that's how I discovered my EDS diagnosis. But yeah, it's just like you're saying, the institutional harm that people with neurodivergence experience was just like a very common thread for me. Yeah, even in college, like I was telling you my boarding school, the caregivers were very white, but the student body was pretty diverse. And then when I got to college, I was like, oh no, it's just white. It's all white here. When I really struggled to just like adapt to the college environment. It was just really hard not really seeing anyone that looked like me. I was the only Black student in all my classes unless I was taking a specific Africana Studies course. And even then, a lot of the Black students that went to that school still were like middle upper class. So none of them were really struggling with poverty. And I was going to the counseling center and just trying to cope with like adjusting to college life. And yeah, essentially me expressing my feelings resulted in me experiencing psychiatric incarceration. And it was just like a slew of other things. Like even after I was released from the psych ward, the school just saying, oh, well, like the campus is still racist. You're still going to experience racism here. And if you couldn't cope with it the first time around, like, what's the point of you coming back? And like putting that on me. And I was just I ended up taking a gap year from college, but I was just, yeah, it's really interesting how, yeah, I've been talking a lot in my clinical social work program about, again, when we talk about catch-all diagnoses that invalidate the struggles that people are experiencing. I think about that with CPTSD. And that's not to say that people who identify with CPTSD, like there's not validity in that or it's not affirming to them, but I do think that sometimes it conflates interpersonal harm with structural harm and therefore leads to a sort of like depoliticization of collective trauma that should be named as collective trauma. And instead, the onus of coping with it goes on to the individual. And so I think, yeah, we're talking about intersections. And I think, neurodivergence and struggling with mental health and physical disability and racism and anti-transness, it's just so linked.
What you said about the depoliticization of collective trauma. I think that's something that frustrates me about a lot of conversations around neurodivergence, and so much of it is about what the individual should be doing to assimilate into this world. And I'm like, we all need more life hacks.
Oh my
We
God.
need to hack the system. We need to hack the world.
Yes, just exactly what you're speaking of, like the onus being put onto the individual. I'm a part of this Facebook group and I forget the name of it. I think it's called like Unicorns, but it's talking about like negatively racialized folks who do have ADHD. And like just I think it was a branch off of a group for folks struggling with ADHD. And then real quickly we're like, yeah, these white folks are never going to validate our feelings. We need to start our own group. And so I think that was born out of it was branched off. And every time I log in and see a post in this group, it's always like, what is wrong with me? Why am I struggling with this? Why is no one around me validating this? And why is there no institutional support for any of the things that I'm struggling with? And it's just like people really struggling with self-compassion and how difficult it is to navigate this world with like being neurodivergent. Just a common thread that I see. Also something I struggle with too, especially because of the ADHD med shortage. I had posted on Close Friends the other day. I finally, I was telling you about some of the stuff that I was struggling with the prior authorization and it finally got approved. But before that, I was struggling with the ADHD med shortage. And so now that I'm back on my meds, I was like, I feel like a different person because this is the first time in 2 years I've been able to wake up early, go work out, eat breakfast, actually pack lunch, shower, and like meaningfully pick my outfit for the day, engage in pet care before work, and then give myself like additional time of like, my commute to work is like 22 minutes. And I was like, oh, I gave myself 45 minutes because, without my ADHD meds, I'm like, yeah, I need exactly 22 minutes to get there. And then knowing that the parking garage is like another 15-minute commute in my wheelchair. So yeah, it was just like I had a really nice day the other day thinking of like, it's just interesting to see how when there are things that we can do for ourselves to support ourselves, there's still institutional barriers, right? It's like, these manufacturers just weren't producing enough of this medication, and half the people in the US who needed these meds, it literally was not available to them at the pharmacy. So what do I do at that point? I ended up switching to the generic of my ADHD med, and that's how I was able to get it filled. But when I was still trying to get the name brand, they say it has the same active ingredients. I don't agree that generic Vyvanse is as effective as name brand Vyvanse. I feel like I have to take a double dose to get the same effectiveness. But yeah, the way that my pharmacy was trying to fill the scripts because they had so little, they would say like, okay, your script is 15th in line and we have X amount of pills. based on the math that we have, we could maybe fill your script once every 5 months. It's like, cool, I get ADHD meds twice a year. I get 1 month of ADHD meds twice a year. Who is that helpful for? And so at the point, I wasn't even bothering to fill it out. And it was, yeah, normally my doctor would just send over an electronic script. And I felt like Oliver Twist. I was like taking like a physical script to different pharmacies, like, please, will you take this? Will you help me? And it just was not effective. I just gave up after a while. I think major companies like CVS, at least they told me they don't even bother filling name brand Vyvanse anymore. They only fill generic to completely avoid that wait list. Yeah.
So I did want to like circle back to what you said about how so many folks like internalize blame for what we perceive to be like our neurodivergent shortcomings. When I mean, I think the most common ones like why can't I just get things done like other people, right? Or like why can't I do things faster? Or why is it that but I can do things when it's my special interest and then yeah, and so much of that is like internalized capitalism and ableism. But why,
Yeah.
like fastness, slowness, that's all relative. Like it was all relative until like colonization came and put this like clock on all of us.
It's so interesting that you say that because as you were saying that, I had this realization of during undergrad, I was abroad for a year. I was doing a French immersion program in Cameroon. Then I was doing ethnographic field research in Tanzania. And I was like, I don't really think I struggled with self-compassion around my ADHD or autism while I was there. And I think part of it was just like people moved when they felt compelled to do so. Like I remember like struggling to get to class on time, and then my professor would show up 3 hours later anyway, and it's like it's over. And they'd be like, "What do you mean? Everyone sit down. I'm here now. You're gonna listen to me speak." It's just like, or we would, or we would plan a trip, and the staff were supposed to be there, and we're like, "Damn, we've been sitting on this hot bus for 2 hours. We're just waiting for this other staff member to arrive." And I'm like, "Yeah, that's kind of how life should be, right? Like none of them have watches or clocks, and it was just like, yeah, we'll just feel things out, and when I feel moved to leave my house, that's when I'll show up to class to
Mhm.
profess."
We're so trapped in like very capitalist like workspaces and schools. We internalize that rush or our inability to rush as much as our own failing. I really hate to say.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is I should probably drop out of my math program. That's what I'm hearing. I'm like just really struggling with yeah, all of these things just because of the pace of academia and or not even, just like the expectations of like the pace of things, but also the like pro-capitalist like expectation, especially like surrounding nonprofits or like caregiving professions that like you should be so committed or overly dedicated to this work that you would do it for free or no pay. So part of the program is me completing 25 hours of unpaid field work a week. And it's just like week to week, I struggle to even hold a paid 15-hour a week job. And somehow I'm expected to almost do double that unpaid so that I can. But then we also have to pay a tuition to attend our unpaid field placement.
Oh
So
my
it's,
gosh.
yeah, it's just like the capitalist grift of like, can we just admit that, academia, they're just like banks that occasionally give classes. Uh, Yeah, I've just been struggling. And the irony of it is I work in LTS services, LITS services, Library Information Technology Services, and my supervisor is through Access Services. And so I work a part-time job on campus in document remediation. It's really interesting in grad school where professors are like, "Oh yeah, you can pay a tuition to learn, to be in my class and access class materials, but that doesn't mean I have to make class materials accessible to you." And it's like, so why am I paying to be here? And so I was in a part of a accessibility work group where we were like, hey, like you need to make your class materials accessible to folks that are low vision or, are hard of hearing or have dyslexia or just, a variety of different disabilities. And the professors came up with like, cool, we agree, we're not going to do it. So then we advocated for a paid position for a student to help them do it. And then I ended up getting hired for that position. So that's what I do now. But I think the irony of like I work with the assistant director of access services and I still haven't been able to access disability accommodations for myself. I have my ADHD documentation and they're like, no, 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 we still need a psychiatrist to do X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, that's a $300 doctor appointment that I cannot afford. And also, even when you do have the accommodations in place, grad school is a little different from the undergrad in that they leave, like, access services can say, we agree that you should have these accommodations in place. Go talk to your professor about it to make sure that they're in place. And the professor can just tell you to like fuck off and be like, why would I do that? And so that was something that happened to me. And I ended up dropping out of a class and transferring the section I was in because I had emailed this professor saying, like, hey, here are the disability accommodations that I need for the semester. She never responded to my email. Mind you, this is a virtual class. She pulls up my email on the first day in front of everyone, my private email that I sent to her about my disability accommodations. And she's just like, I just want us all to collectively agree that disability accommodations, like academic accommodations, are for snowflakes that cannot hack it intellectually and need to get a one-up on their classmates. These accommodations have no place in this classroom. And to just sit there and have just see all of my classmates nodding and agreeing and just like shitting on private accommodations that I had asked for. And I think the most ironic part of it all was that this professor's specialization was in BIPOC mental health. And I was just like, you don't think accommodations are a form of suicide prevention? But yeah, so I just think about, yeah, institutions just like fail. They just fail to accommodate neurodivergence in any capacity.
I'm stress crunching my stress ball. It's a crunchy stress ball. I'm so angry right now. That is fucked up. That is just fucked up. A private email
Yep.
and calling disabled people snowflakes. Oh my God, I'm so sorry you went through that risk. Like truly, that's horrifying.
The next semester, they got tenure, even after I reported them. Yeah. So yeah.
Did you end up like dropping a class or like getting your money back?
Yeah, I switched to a different section, which I was actually really grateful for because it allowed me to have my first Black professor in the program, and she was really great. But yeah, it was just sort of like, I don't know, it was just this weird, like, cool, now I'm like forced to interact with this professor who treated me this way for the rest of my graduate school experience and just act like this wasn't so violent. And also, I just feel like that's a form of bullying. Like, what grown-ass professor is gonna pull up private emails and just try to get the whole classroom to like invalidate someone's disability? Like,
Well, it's straight up abuse. Yeah, I've had professors where they do that because their egos are super fragile. It's infuriating to hear that's still happening.
and you're right. I just feel like so much of education is about control because, I think even when even when that age gap is super huge and you're a super young child, I think about the ways in which, in order to engage in academia, you're expected to sort of disconnect from your very basic somatic needs in order to like get through the day, right? Like kids are pretty intuitive eaters. They know, like, they know when they have to use the bathroom, they know when they need food, but it's like, oh, when you're in school, you can only have breakfast before school and everyone collectively has to eat lunch at noon or something like that. Or like you get one bathroom break throughout the day. And I'm just like, I think, yeah, it's really interesting. Like, my insurance saying that I was no longer school aged and therefore not struggling shouldn't be struggling with ADHD symptoms. And I really do think it's like school tries to remove any sort of like ADHD symptoms from us through like, getting us to ignore our needs, ignore our bodies, ignore not be in touch with ourselves somatically to make us better workers. So I think the insurance's logic is like, by the time that you're of working age and should be holding a job, you should not be struggling with these things because the institution should have gotten rid of it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. But for anyone who's listening, like ADHD, autism, and ADHD are not things that you grow out of. There's a reason in the DSM, like, it's something that has been with you from childhood and continues to like interfere with your daily life. And as much as the DSM is super flawed and phrased through a very pathological lens, like it does acknowledge that it's a lifelong thing. Yeah, how do you navigate ADHD in your daily life, relationships, community, and what brings you joy? Because we talked a lot of like angry stuff, but I also want to make room for, our joy. And all of it is valid. All of it is valid. And shit is really fucked up. Right.
Think like for me personally, having both ADHD and autism led me to work in fields that would validate or like support. So like now I'm, like I'm saying, I'm working in pediatrics, specifically in neurodevelopmental disabilities, and I'm like supporting families in getting their autistic children or children with ADHD and like other disabilities, like support very early on to make sure that child is in an affirming environment, make sure that like their schooling institutions are held accountable for upholding those accommodations, just making sure that they live lives where they don't, like we're saying, they're not internalizing this blame and that they're able to lead with self-compassion. Yeah. And so I think the other thing about working specifically with chronically ill and disabled children or in children with neurodevelopmental disabilities is like that means my coworkers have a very sound understanding of how that manifests in people's lives, and therefore there's a lot more compassion and grace extended to coworkers who also have those disabilities. And so I do feel like I'm in a really affirming work environment right now. I would love to stay at CHOP long term, but funding and social work don't really go hand in hand. But so that's another issue. But yeah, I think something that brings me joy is like my artwork. Like I think creativity and neurodivergence just go hand in hand. And where I'm actually speaking from my at-home art studio, I just moved about 2 weeks ago, and what really led me to living where I am right now is I'm living in an intentional community for disabled folks. So there are 20 units for wheelchair users that are well above ADA standard. But part of it was that here I could afford a bedroom and a separate art studio. Before, my art studio was just kind of like part of my living room and it was really cramped. But yeah, now I have an entire art studio just dedicated to continuing to make art for the community and through my position at CHOP. So I'm also doing, it's called LEND, Leadership Education and Neurodevelopmental Disabilities Research Fellowship. Part of that, I need an independent project. And so my supervisor said that I could do art therapy groups with some of our clients. A lot of them named struggling with traditional therapy, like disabled kids tend to have a lot of disability related trauma, and people with large amount of traumas tend to really struggle with talk therapy. They're like, this is not for me. I don't feel affirmed. I don't like going to this. I don't like doing this. And so it's like, cool. Now I'm also in a position to offer alternative affirming forms of therapy to other neurodivergent people. And so I'm going to start doing a fiber arts club for some of the kids, and I'm really excited. It's therapy, but they won't know it's therapy.
I love that. And I was gonna make a joke and then I forgot. There will be more yarns against the machine.
Yes.
And what was I gonna say? Yeah, I mean, it totally makes sense to like for us to access healing in more like body-based or tactile ways. I mean, that's kind of how we experience the world. I'm doing the thing where I lose my train of thought. I'm in the middle of like an MCAS flare, so like I have a sinus headache. I took a painkiller before this, and I still, oh well, this is the reality. I mean, talking about, we're just putting all of it all on the table. This is reality of chronic illness. We're doing this while in pain and sick, but
Definitely,
we're still here.
definitely struggling with an IBS flare while I was booting up my this interview. So yeah, but yeah, I just think that there's so much joy in crip kinship in general, and just like organizing with other disabled people and just being in community with them, just feeling affirmed. I think so much of joy in my life comes from having had recognized very young on that like not every group of people that I will be forced to interact with will be my people. And then once I do find my people and find people that are affirming and supportive and will just validate and accommodate.
Yeah, totally. I think when I was like just knee deep in just corporate work, it was really hard for me to find community because like here the expat community is super white and like politically disengaged. So it's very hard to relate to them. So I tried to look online, and this was before I had Instagram. And just the way algorithms are shaped, it's super hard to find resources if you don't know where to look, right? And then when I start connecting with other chronically ill people, other disabled people, I'm like, oh my God, I can have a conversation without having to justify every part of my existence. I can just say like, I'm in pain today, and someone will say like, I'm sorry, like I hope you're taking care of yourself, not feel better soon, not get well soon. Like, have you
Yeah.
tried this?
Oh God. Yeah, I think about that so much, and we were talking about how, of course, adults still navigate autism and ADHD symptoms. Part of through the work that I do at the Children's Hospital is, well, technically, like, yes, it's a children's hospital, but I work with folks from like 17, 18 up till 30. And part of it is like there's different waivers in PA. And one of those waivers is an adult autism waiver that can help you get the support that you need, whether that's like employment support or transportation or in-home care or any of those things. And yeah, I think that's also, I was struggling with day-to-day things, whether, and I think there's such an overlap between some of the things like some of my neurodivergent symptoms and some of my physical chronic pain symptoms that I was just, I was like struggling to like get groceries and make a meal plan and cook food and like make sure my house was clean and different things like that. And so I'm not on the adult autism waiver, I'm on a different waiver, but it's funded very similarly. And so now I have about 64 hours of in-home care, and that has like changed my life completely. And the thing that I particularly love about it is I'm doing participant directed care. So I, as a disabled person, get to direct my own care instead of some rando nurse from an agency like coming in my home every day. And, I have like very intentionally hired other chronically ill disabled people in my community that struggle to hold full-time employment. And I've just like parsed, instead of just giving like one person 40 hours a week, I've just like parsed out several part-time jobs in order to help them live sustainably and also like further build community with other disabled people. Yeah, because there's just not enough part-time work for people that cannot work full-time, and there are not enough
Yep.
employers to understand how chronic pain or neurodivergence manifests. And I'm willing to accommodate my workers, however, and that looks like, for some of my workers, it literally looks like here's a day-to-day checklist of everything you need to do with all of, with over explained and like hyper instructions, because I know that's what you like. So I'm willing to do that. Or, one of my workers, they called out disabled the other day, and I was like, cool. I have no questions. But if you need something, I'm here, because it's, I don't know. I just like worked at so many workplaces where they're like, oh, you just always seem to be sick. And I was like, that's so interesting. It's kind of like when you're chronically ill, you're sick a lot. Like, I should never do that to my workers, Call out disabled. Cool.
Yeah, I think what you're doing is amazing. And I really hope that it gives folks out there, who think that we have to figure it all out on our own and be ashamed of having like caregivers and external support when no human being was ever built to like survive any of this, especially a world that's currently on fire alone. Like my partner is now my caregiver and he has taken over things that I'm terrified of talking to delivery workers and people who come to my door. I've just been yelled at by so many of them who think that I'm being obtuse when I talk to them on the phone. So I'm just like, you handle all of that. You handle small talk with like cab drivers and body doubling to get like personal care tasks done. Things that like I originally felt ashamed of, even though I knew helped me immensely. And then now I realize like that shame just belongs to an ableist society that thinks the peak of adulting is being like hyper independent.
I feel that so much. Like, when I put my job listings, I put job listings through Instagram because I was just, how else will I find all the neurodivergence? So I put my job listing on Instagram, and it was like you're saying, it was a very vulnerable thing to like have to describe the tasks and responsibilities of like what people would be helping me with, because then I had to be transparent about what I'm struggling with, right? It's just like, yeah, sometimes I struggle to shower on my own or like literally feed myself and make sure that like the groceries in my fridge aren't rotting. And like you're saying, it definitely takes a whole community. We're not made to do these things independently. I think of like all of the staff that I have. Like I have dietary aides that do all of my grocery shopping and cooking. And then I have two of those so that you can rotate bi-weekly, because it's a lot to do that for yourself and then also do it for another person. And I don't want them to burn out. I have an admin aide to help with all of my disability related paperwork, because that's a whole other third job in my life, right? I have a personal aide that comes every afternoon to help with day-to-day stuff like pet care, dishes, helping with hygiene, different things like that. I have a morning aide because my pain meds make me so drowsy. I would never wake up on time if a physical human was not in my home waking me up, right? And then I have a weekend aide to do all of the deep cleaning, because my personal aide does so much day to day. There's no way that they could actually like also like meaningfully clean my home too. So yeah, and then there's a bunch of like backup aides, right? Because people deserve vacation time and mental health days and to be able to call out disabled, and just because they don't feel like coming into work. Like, so yeah, there's a lot of vulnerability, I think, required in order to intentionally communicate your access needs. And I think that there's a lot of intimacy and beauty that comes out of being in community with people who are willing to fulfill those needs. Yeah.
What's the biggest thing you want other newly realized queer ADHD BIPOC folks to know, like to so that they feel less alone?
I think I would have to go back to the self-compassion. Like, please center self-compassion. Try your best to move away from feeling like there is something internally wrong with you or that this is an individual issue. Like, it is about a society and systems that refuse to accommodate disability and neurodivergence. And that is not reflective of like your humanities, your capabilities, or your value or worth. Yeah.
We're coming to the end. There was something I did want to ask you. If you have this overlap where you're both like ADHD, neurodivergent, and have a physical disability that requires like physical therapy, how does anyone do it?
Yeah. Well, for me, physical therapy, I don't know. It's something that I've always been in and out of, because like you're saying, I know that it helps, and also I hate being there. I feel like physical therapists are not trained to understand disability. They are trained to understand temporary injury. And so anytime I get there and I'm like, cool, I'm a wheelchair user. I have not walked for more than 5 minutes in the last 3 years. They're like, cool. So let's start you out with 40 minutes on the treadmill. And then they do the pre-test of like where your baseline is. And then after a couple weeks, they do another test to see if you're improving. They're like, for some reason your numbers have gone down. And I'm like, it's almost as if the things you're asking me to do make me more ill sometimes. So I think it's for me, I'm always in and out of physical therapy. Eventually I'll go back, but I think for me it's been trying to find alternative ways to be attuned to my body and just like more affirming practitioners. I've been seeing a somatic therapist for a couple years now, and I do think like pairing that with physical therapy. So like being very mindful of how my body's feeling when I'm in physical therapy. Also, I've just started like, I moved into this intentional community for disabled folks, and they do have an ADA compliant gym downstairs. It's hard when you're nerd when your ADHD is just like, avoid, or like I'd rather be doing this thing. This is a really funny like thing I've done for myself, but I've been finding like special interest albums, and then I'll just like blast them while I'm on the treadmill or like working out. And I'm like, cool, I got to do something I'm really interested in. It's something I really didn't want to do before my day started. And that's what I've been doing. But yeah, I have been looking for, like queer or fatter physical therapists, or also disabled themselves, that like I feel like would be mindful. Because I think part of it with before I could name my hypermobility, the issue was like, cool, when I do lunges like this, it really hurts. And then they're just like, oh, it's because you don't do lunges enough. And it's like, so yeah, I was able to find an orthotics and prosthetic doc who was able to get me like all of my splints and braces and everything. And now one of my right knee is so bad, like in terms of like hypermobility, that in order to even like stand for a couple of minutes, I have to use a locking brace. So it like completely locks my knee in place so that I can't bend and I can't fall or can't buckle. So like also just I feel like that's a whole other form of self-compassion, but like being realistic with yourself about like what assistive devices you need to be able to do the thing that you want to do. I think that's also been helpful too. So yeah. Yeah, it's a journey. But yeah, I'm really excited to partner with folks who are willing to like help me move my bodies in a way that's affirming to me while also respecting like my boundaries around the ways that I am and am not willing to move my body.
Oh, thanks so much for sharing that. I hear you on the special interest albums. I cannot get through doing the exercises without putting on a TV show that I've watched like a million times. Yeah, I think hearing about your experiences living in an intentional community for disabled people, hiring aides who are also like disabled and chronically ill, and and then now you said you're also looking for support with, is it like physical therapy from someone who gets it also. I don't know, it just gives me a lot of hope. It's like the country I'm in right now, the services are very limited. There's no ADHD meds. And like you said, it actually does make a difference. And my internalized ableism is like, you'll be fine with just coffee. No, like I have not been fine. How can we support Yarn Against the Machine? Just support your general well-being and uplift you.
Yeah, follow my page. I'm always doing raffles, and of course, I need people to enter the raffles in order to fundraise for the folks that we want to fundraise for. And I think general well-being, I'm about to start fundraising for a wheelchair accessible van because I do feel like that is the last thing I need in my life to fully live independently and have interdependence in the way that I would like to. So yeah, check out that fundraiser too. But yeah, just like support my artwork, reach out for collaborations. Yeah, I love working with other artists and creatives and just, using our collective artistry in terms of like advocacy or just like dissent in general. So yeah, thank you.
So for anyone listening, so you're mainly on Instagram, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll put Yarn Against the Machine in the show notes. And once again, this was part of the Queer AuDHD BIPOC project. Riz's story will also be in the book. And right now you can pre-order the book. If you pre-order, you'll get a shout out on the podcast and in the book. You'll be helping me pay all of the incredible Queer AuDHD BIPOC interviewees who are participating in this project. Yeah, and then once all the project costs have been paid off, the funds from this book will go equally towards the Autistic People of Color Mutual Aid Fund and to our disabled Palestinian friend Nara. She has a family of 4 surviving genocide in Gaza, Palestine, and she really needs our support. Please go to rewilding.cc/book to help with this crowdfunding project, to pre-order your book and get all the behind-the-scenes perks, and to support Riz, support autistic people of color, support Nara. And thank you for listening.